usually introduce the speaker. So it's me tonight, and I'm excited to talk to you about how you and your product team can excel at user experience design. And it's interesting, I have an older talk on UX design that I pretty much completely revamped and rewrote here. And I was trying to cut slides. It's like there's so much you can talk about with UX design. As product managers, we're all trying to achieve product market fit. That's a concept that I talk a lot about in my books and my talks. And it basically means you're meeting customer needs in a way that is better than the other products that are out there. And it's hard to achieve. As we know, many products fail. Like there are statistics that over 80% of new products fail. And I want to share a story of a product that I worked on. We knew that in order to achieve product market fit, we had to be customer centric. So of course we went out and talked to customers. And here's how the customer told us, describe the product that they wanted to us. The PM took a slightly different version of what they heard. They had a slightly different vision of what the product was, but we felt like I would get enough handle on it to get started, started working with developers, started heading towards the alpha milestone. Okay, let's get to the alpha milestone. We got to the alpha milestone. There were some issues. It didn't quite work the way we had expected, but we totally pivoted and fixed it for the beta. So the beta was fine. And then, of course, we work with the dev team to come up with a schedule. When do we think the launch date's going to be? This was what was actually ready by the original launch date that we had come up with. At this point, marketing got involved. That's how they advertised the product. And then sales team got involved, and that's how they sold the product. And here's what the customer wanted the whole time, basically, right? So it's just a funny cartoon strip about the uncertainty that's there when you're trying to meet customer needs and achieve product market fit. It's a lot of uncertainty. It reminds me of my kids, like a telephone game, when one kid whispers in another ear, and by the time you get to the end, the message gets all like convoluted. So I've been fortunate in my career to work with a lot of different product teams on helping them achieve product market fit. And so that's why I wrote my book, The Lean Product Playbook. The key framework in it is the product market fit pyramid. I want to explain this quickly so that we have the context for where UX fits in. The product market fit pyramid, it's a 5-layer pyramid. And the way to think about it is each of those layers is one of the 5 key hypotheses that you need to get right enough in order to achieve product market fit. The bottom of the pyramid, the foundation, is the target customer. Who are we trying to create value for? Whose life are we trying to make better? Whose pain points are we trying to address? Everything starts with that. And everything, like a real pyramid, the layers are supposed to build on top of each other. So the second layer is, for that customer, what are their underserved needs, right? We want to focus on needs, not solutions. I cover that in some of my other talks. I'm not going to cover that today, as well as the word underserved. But taken together, those 2 layers form a market. And if you look in an economics or marketing textbook, it'll say a market is a group of people that share a set of common needs, right? So those are the 2 market layers. And you don't actually control the market. You don't control what they can do. You can pick which market you want to go after. What you control are the product layers. And the first product layer is your value proposition. Now, in an ideal world, this value prop is directly coupled to these underserved needs, but we don't know yet if we are or not. Your value prop is what needs are you going to deliver for customers, and how are you going to do so in a way that's better or different than the competition. Next layer up is feature set or functionality. The feature set or functionality is what actually conveys the benefits to the customers, so that they can get the benefits in your value proposition. And then finally, that's where user experience comes in. User experience, that's what the user actually interacts with to use the functionality to get the benefits in your value proposition. So all product market fit is just, okay, we're making all these decisions and assumptions up here and executing in the product, going after this target market. How well are the decisions and execution that we're doing? How well do they resonate with our target market, basically? And once I created the pyramid, I realized, I can create a process to guide people through forming and testing and iterating these hypotheses. And that's a lean product process. So we start at the bottom. We get clear on what are our hypotheses about the customer. What do we think their needs are? What do we think our value proposition should be? What do we think the functionality should be? And by the way, this is where MVP comes in at this layer. So you don't overscope or overbuild. And then what should the user experience be? And I'm a big fan of testing with prototypes before you do any coding at all. And so at the tip of the pyramid now, when you work your way up, that UX design that you have, whether it's a prototype or a mock-up or a live product, say you've already just went and coded it instead of testing prototypes, that represents all of the decisions you've made along the way. And so there's just one sixth step, which we take that UX, whether it's a prototype or live product, and we close the loop and test with customers to see where we're at. So I just want to provide that broader framework. I'm going to be focusing my talk right here on the tip of the pyramid, UX design. Most of my talks focus on like layers 2 and 3. if you've seen some of my other talks. So this is where I want to go deep on UX design. User experience is a really, really important topic. I learned this very early in my product management career. So I started my product management career at Intuit. And I was very fortunate because I asked people, hey, where's the best place to learn product management? Because I had never done it when I was coming out of business school, and everybody said Intuit. So I was lucky to get a job there. And I walked into basically like a machine. And back then, what you would do is you would write a big product requirements document, right? Some of you that have been around for a while, you know what I'm talking about, either MRD or PRD, right? It looks something like this. I remember when I was there, it was like 80 pages long, and every PM was contributing to it. And the mentality was, hey, if I just spend a little more time writing some more requirements or refining them, then it's going to be better. The product's going to be better. And while having good requirements is important, I realized, hey, I can do my first time through the software cycle there, I realized we can do all this stuff on this PRD or MRD, but if the user experience isn't good, it doesn't matter. So both need to be good. The requirements need to be good and the UX needs to be good. But the UX is it's like a distinct thing. It's separate from what you write up in the requirements, right? You could write the requirements and then, do a UX, create a UX this way or create a UX this way. And so, one of my favorite sayings is a user experience is like a joke. If you have to explain it, it's not good, right? That's the basic thing about user experience. Like the user should just be able to figure out what it is, right? Dave Chappelle is one of my favorite comedian guys here. So luckily he doesn't have to explain his jokes. He's pretty funny. So we don't want to have to explain our UX designs to users, right? In a usability test, you want them to be able to just figure it out and not have to go through it. So the other thing where I like to provide context for UX is, we are writing PRDs or we're writing a set of user stories, right? And if you follow my process and you're coming up with the problem space and your value prop and all that, you're gonna basically have a bunch of words. Their ideas are words. They're gonna be in Google Docs or in Jira or something. But we don't ship words to our customers, right? We need to write those words so that the team can get clear on what we're gonna build. But what we ship is we ship a coded product. We ship the built product, right? So how do we get from these words and ideas to the coded product? UX design is what feels like, yeah, how's that actually gonna look? How's it actually gonna work, right? And one thing I wanna start off with is, and I've found this, I've been talking about this for a while, and it's still the case, not as much, but it still happens, is that many product teams have what I call a UX design gap. You've got a gap. And what do I mean by that? It means that you just don't have the design resources you need, the level, either like the amount of design resources you need or the skill level that you need, right? And so there's like a maturity model, and I've seen different models over time, levels over time. So I just want to go through these and explain them by categorizing things as far as like, is there somebody thinking about how to define the product? This is typically product manager's job, defining it. Like, who's the customers? What are their needs, right? What's our value prop? That's definition. Designing it, that's user experience design, obviously. Designing it and then coding it, right? The most very common pattern that you see is just this. You've only got engineering and you don't have any PM, you don't have any design. There are plenty of products being built in the world like this. Just some coders saying, hey, I think this is cool, I'm building it. Or some team of developers, right? And so no one's explicitly covering define or design. The next level up, you might have product management plus engineering. There are a lot of companies or teams that are like this, right? You've got engineering, and now instead of it only being engineering, you've got PM. But the reality is, PM's thinking about definition and engineering's thinking about code, but no one's really like a designer. There's no designer in the mix. So this will be better. Level 2 is better than level 1 because someone's going to be thinking about customers and their needs, but the design is going to fall short, right? Now, sometimes you can get a PM who picked up and learned about UX design, so they can cover some of that gap. They can help close some of the gap, but not all the way. Or likewise, you might get some engineer who's on the front end engineer who's really picked up some UX design skills, so they can help close the gap, so it's not as big of a gap. And maybe between the two of them, they can kind of cover the gap fully, right? And I will say, in the early days of Intuit Quicken, for example, was a very successful product which had good ease of use, and it's been around for a long time. It was around before UX design was really a formal thing, and this is largely how they got by. The PMs and the engineers just kind of had enough UX sense to kind of cover the bases. Now, the level you ideally want to get to is level 5, where you actually do have a designer staff now, right? You've got PM, UX, and engineering. They're all adequately staffed. everybody's got the skills that they need, and they're collaborating closely. That's how you get good user experience designs, is by having all three of those working concepts. And in fact, the logo of our meetup is it's basically a different version of that, of those three. You know, it's a common Venn diagram you see that those three are required, basically, right? So what I want to do real quick is just to make this a little more interactive is get a poll. So I've described this design gap, what a design gap is, and I'm going to launch a poll real quick. I'm going to ask you basically, you know, do you typically have a design gap on your product team? No, I always have enough rockstar design resources at my disposal. Lucky you. Yes, sometimes. Yes, frequently. Yes, pretty much all the time. So I'm curious to see what the distribution is from our group. So you should see the poll in Zoom somewhere. And I'll share the poll as soon as we get a bunch of questions. So we got people are quick. Thanks. 65%, 70% of people have voted already. That's great. By the way, we've got 100 participants, so that's awesome. Okay. Give it a couple more seconds here and we'll see what we got. Okay. I think we got everybody who's going to vote. Let's see. All right, here we go. So can you all see the poll? Right, so the most common answer was 39%, yes, I sometimes have a design gap. Second most common was yes, I frequently have a design gap, 27%. The next answer was no, I always have enough rockstar design resources at my disposal, 20%. And then yes, I pretty much have a design gap all the time at 14%. So, and that's what's interesting is it can change. It can be situational, right? You may be like, hey, I'm at level 5, everything's good, I've got the resource I need, and then your designer quits, and then you're out of luck, right? Or that designer gets pulled onto a different project or something, right? Or you get pulled on a different project that doesn't have a designer, right? So it can be very dynamic. So I'm not surprised that sometimes I have a design gap is the top answer, or maybe you have a designer, but you only have half of their time and it's not enough time. So that's a very common thing. So when back to that, old PRD, when I was at Intuit, that first product cycle I worked on for Quicken, I'm like, wow, I didn't know nothing about UX design and it's so important. So I went out and I sought a lot of whatever learning and resources I could. And the one thing I found, one of the things I found that I found super, super helpful was this framework by Jesse James Garrett. So Jesse James Garrett founded Adaptive Path, which is a leading UX design firm that actually got acquired by Capital One. He also coined the term AJAX. So he's an early UX thought leader. And when I saw this diagram, I'm like, oh my gosh, yes. I'm like, wow, he's really breaking down what user experience is. And so he calls it the elements of user experience. And it's a framework or a model to break down the different components. At the bottom, you've got abstract, more abstract. At the top, you've got more concrete. Down here, things at the bottom are things like, what are the objectives for our site or product? What are user needs? As a PM, I'm like, yeah, that's great. As a PM, I think about those things. Next thing is, what's the functional specification, content requirements, interaction design, information architecture, interface design, visual design. So I thought this was great. I was like, oh my gosh, I was geeking out looking at this going, wow, now I can really understand what all the components are. And then he actually wrote a book called The Elements of User Experience, where he kind of simplified a little bit and just called each of these 5 planes, gave it a name, like strategy, scope, structure, skeleton, surface. So that's if this model, it's great, it's very intricate. It also might be a little too complicated. It's got so many pieces in it, right? But it just shows you that there are different elements of user experience. That's what I like the most about it. And he has a short book that covers this framework that I would recommend. And I'll list the recommended books at the end. Here's how I like to describe it. It's a little simpler. It has 4 layers. I like to think of UX design as an iceberg. And the reason, with 4 layers in it, and the reason I like to think of it as an iceberg is because, like an iceberg, there's a part that's above the surface that's obvious, that everybody sees, but there's more going on beneath the surface that's not as obvious, that people don't see. What's that part above the water? The part that's obvious that everybody sees is visual design, right? We are wired to take in most of our information visually. Like, you're looking at my slides now, we're all looking at each other's camera right now, right? I would say we take in like 90+% of our information through our eyes visually, maybe some through our ears when we're listening. But that's basically, how we take it in. You're looking at shapes, colors, letters, images, all that kind of stuff, right? But the reality is, when you use a product that has a good user experience, it's because the team has done a good job, not only at that visual design level, but at these, less obvious layers beneath the waterline, conceptual design, information architecture, interaction design. And so I want to spend some time talking about each one of these, showing you some of the what's important, some examples, and some concepts that are important to know. Let's start with conceptual design. Conceptual design is the most abstract, but it's basically like, what's the fundamental concept for how we're approaching designing the user experience for this product? It's probably best described by example. So going to Quicken, when Quicken came out, and I wrote about this in the book, it's a well-known story. When the founders of Quicken came out with Quicken, they were already, it was a pretty crowded market. There were already like 45 other product personal finance software packages out there. But they tested them out and they said, you know what, we just don't think any of these are easy enough to use. And so we had a hypothesis that if we come out with a personal finance software package that's significantly easier to use than the ones that are out there, we think we can be a market leader here, right? And that's what happened. Now, how did they go after the hypothesis? What was the UX that they went for, right? Well, what they did, it's been around for a while. Back then, most people use checkbooks. And so they made the assumption, they made a hypothesis that if we make the user interface look like a checkbook, where you just fill in the date and you fill in the payee and you fill in the amounts like a checkbook, then there's going to be a really easy learning curve for people, and they're going to be able to figure out how to use it and use it. And so they basically built their UI with the checkbook metaphor to enter the data, and it worked out. And so they quickly shot up to #1, and they joke about having 46 mover advantage instead of first mover advantage, basically, right? Let me talk about a more recent example, which is Uber, right? Here's Uber's app. And the cool thing about a conceptual design, this is actually the high fidelity pixel perfect version of their design. The conceptual design, if we just take that away, you can kind of describe it verbally. And it's not that it's map centric. There are plenty of map centric apps out there. But what we do is say, okay, let's show the user, this is a conceptual design of Uber, how I would describe it. Let's show the user in the middle of the map. And then let's show the cars on the map where they are. And then after you hail a car, let's show it coming towards you. That is the conceptual design. This is the high fidelity pixel realization of that design. So that's the conceptual design. So conceptual design, is the foundation again. The next layer up is information architecture. And information architecture is basically how you structure and organize the functionality information in your product, right? Overall, what's going on, as well as like within a page, what's the information architecture within a page? Basically how you organize different sections. Products, especially as they go over time, you're gonna have multiple features and multiple pages or multiple screens. Well, who's thinking about how those are organized? And also how they're labeled, right? When you use a product that has good information architecture, it kind of recedes into the background. You're just like, you're going to find something, you click on a label that seems to make sense, it takes you to the place where you do the thing you want to do. You don't even think about it. You more run into information architecture when it's bad. You run into friction. You're like, I can't find where to do this. So I think it's going to be here, and you go here and the thing's not there, basically, right? That's navigation is also related closely to information architecture as well. So the design artifact, for a lot of these, like, how do we think about information architecture? How do we document it? It's basically a sitemap, and it comes from the days of a website. And obviously now a lot of us work on mobile apps, but they don't call it a mobile app map. They just still call it a sitemap. And so I'm going to show you an example in a sec here. And what I want to do is go through these different components of UX design with a real example. And so I'm sure a lot of you have seen Queen's Gambit, right? It's very popular. I just saw it. I loved it. I thought it was awesome. You're probably wondering why is Dan talking about Queen's Gambit. The reason I'm talking about that is because I found there's a very popular app called chess.com. It's like probably the top chess app. So I used to play chess when I was a kid. I loved it. I stopped playing when I went to college. And then Queen's Gambit got me excited about it again. So I went out there and said, let me find a good chess app, and chess.com. So I started playing that app. And in fact, they're pretty cool. You can actually play Beth Harmon at different ages. They have a bot. They have a Beth Harmon bot. I can beat her at 8 years old. That's not a problem. I can't beat her at 20 years old though, right? Her rating goes up depending on what you got. So anyway, why am I telling you about chess.com? Because to illustrate this, I found an example of a designer online. It's a great example. The designer's name is Jake Leanheers. He's from Australia with a studio called New Breed Studio. And he basically said he likewise, with COVID, a lot of people, chess got very popular. And then Queen's Gambit came out, chess got super popular. And so like a lot of people, he got into chess and he started using the product. And like a good designer, he said, I don't think this is as easy to use as it could be. And so he went in, and here's his proposed sitemap for it, right? He took their existing functionality and remapped it and color coded it. So this is a great example of a sitemap where you can see there's thought going into what are the different sections going to be, learn, puzzle, play, social, profile, right? How is, and what are the subcomponents? What are the other screens that you can go to within there, right? And how do you get from one to the other? And what's the global nav and all that, right? So this is an example of a sitemap. And, product, pretty easy to create. Well, I skipped the one. He actually documented the existing sitemap before he proposed this one. The existing one has a lot more crisscrossing lines. It's not as clean and clear. So you can start out by just doing a sitemap of your current product, right? How are things organized today? And you can see how intuitive it is. And one thing that happens is, as you roll out new features and new screens and new pages, it gets messy. It's like a garden. It's like, overgrowing, and you got to go back and organize it basically, right? So you might find opportunities to do a better job organizing it. Now, once you're kind of clear on the information architecture, another key component is layout. How are we actually going to lay these things out? What are the elements going to be? And this is where wireframes are a very powerful tool. So I'm curious, I didn't do a poll here. How many people here wireframe? If you want to raise your hand or say yes in the chat or something. I hope that a lot of you wireframe, especially going back to the design. Someone says sometimes, exactly. Going back to that design gap question. If you sometimes, the most common thing is, if we took sometimes and basically 80% of people, only 20% of people said I never have a design gap. So the rest of you, 80% of us at some point in time have, frequently or sometimes have a design gap. Well, by being able to wireframe, you can basically, do some of it. You're not going to be the world's best designer, but you can help figure things out. And good PMs fill vacuums, right? Fill voids that exist in their team. So, and there are plenty of PMs who wireframe. So you don't need to be a designer. You don't need to be, off the charts talented in design to use it. So a wireframe, what is a wireframe? A wireframe, the way I would describe it, it's a low fidelity representation of UX. What does fidelity mean? Fidelity means, compared to the final product, how closely does it resemble the final polished product? So a live product is the highest fidelity possible, right? You can see this is lower fidelity than a live product. This is a balsamic wireframe. How is it lower fidelity? Well, we're not doing any colors, right? Back to the pyramid, it's human nature to just fixate on the visual design. That's all people see, right? The number of times I've taken a set of mock-ups to a key stakeholder and we said, hey, and the teams had all these tough discussions about information architecture and layout and all this, and we bring it to the key stakeholder and they go, first thing they say is, what's this color orange? I don't like this orange that you guys used at all. It's like, are you serious? Like, why are we talking about the orange? We need to talk about the feature set, the layout, things like that. So if you make your wireframes grayscale, it just takes that off the table. It puts horse blinders on for color so people can't engage with color. It better also not to go and worry about fonts yet. Don't put any images in, right? It's really just about what are the key things you're trying to identify. What elements need to be on the screen? What are the relative sizes? And what's the approximate layout? That's the goal of a wireframe, right? That's the goals of a wireframe. And by doing it this way, you kind of put horse blinders on that visual part that everybody fixates on, and you make them engage with these three elements, right? That's a wireframe. Quick thing for balsamic. This slide is an old slide, and I just quick pitch if you're not using, if you're like, yeah, I'm up for wireframing, Dan, balsamic is your friend. It's super easy to learn. It's got a widget library. You can annotate it with sticky notes. You can call things out. You can have click or tappable navigation. So you can string together multiple pages. You can export it as a PDF. Sometimes part of the problem is the other person who's going to consume your wireframe needs to have the tool too. Not here. You can just export it as a PDF. Makes it super easy. And it's a great value for the price. Some of these tools are really expensive. It's not. So anyway, I would check it out. I would definitely take advantage of the offer that they offer our group. Now, in contrast, you probably heard the word mockup. So what's the difference between a wireframe and a mockup? I want to show you the two side by side for the exact same screen so you can really see the difference, right? On the left, we have a low fidelity wireframe. Can't tell me you don't like the orange. Can't tell me you don't like my font. I haven't picked those yet, right? On the right now, we have the exact same screen where we have picked colors. We picked orange. We put in some photos. We picked the font. We have some icons, right? That's the difference between low fidelity wireframe and high fidelity mockup. And in general, it's best practice to do a wireframe first and iterate in the wireframe before you worry about it. One thing I will say, back to the pyramid, back to the iceberg, there is a key difference between visual design and like interaction design. And the reality is most designers are better at one or the other. It's kind of like being left-handed or right-handed. There are people certainly that have built the muscle up on the other one. But a lot of times I'll work with, in my clients, I'll work with the company and they'll say, yeah, I'll say, do you have a designer? I say, yeah, we'll have a designer. and they will quickly go to high fidelity colors and fonts and images. And typically when the designer quickly goes there to high fidelity, I know that they're probably a visual designer, right? They're not doing a sitemap, they're not doing this, and they're not doing a wireframe. They're going straight to high fidelity, right? And you just run the risk. You can do it. It's better than not doing any design, but I like to do a progressive approach to it. And I'll show you at the end. I'll close out with the workflow, my preferred workflow. But when you are doing wireframes or mockups, for that matter, one of the key concepts, important principles of layout is visual hierarchy. And so I want to explain visual hierarchy here, right? It's very important because it impacts how people read your page, what they pay attention to, what order they pay attention to, right? And it just has to do, is one of the books I'm going to recommend, with how your visual part of your brain and your eyes are wired. So what I want to do is show you an abstract example. We've got 3 circles here, right? We've got this big blue one here. This is a lime green. It's very light lime green here, and a small red one here. I know some people have red green. 10% of people have red green color blindness, so you might not be able to see the difference here. But this is blue. This one's green, this one's red. And what I want to do is do a quick poll and ask people what order, if you had to rank order these 1, 2, 3 of importance, is it like, is it like red, yellow, blue, red, green, blue? Is it red, blue, green? Right? Let me do a quick poll here. I can get my cursor back. There it is. There we go. Let me get my second poll for the night here. Where's polls? Polling. Cool. So I'm going to run the second poll. And you basically there's 6 choices of the order. So just tell me there, the poll should be launched now. You should be able to see it. Looking at this picture, what does your brain tell you the order of importance? What's the most important circle? What's the second most? What's the third most? Let's see what people say. And again, if you have trouble seeing the color, this one's red and this one's green. It's very light green actually, and this one's blue. So I considered putting colors on, but then that would give some primacy, or some numbers or letters, but that would give primacy, and I didn't want to do that as well. Okay, we got 80% of people voted. Nice, thank you everyone for voting so quickly. Okay, let's see the results. Are we ready? The warm color, here you go, nice. Okay, let's see, a couple people are voting still. Interestingly, we have at least one person for every answer. It's orange, yes, thank you, Jen, you can see that. People see colors slightly differently. Purple and blue, I see people a lot of times, purple and blue. You don't see the poll. Santa, it's on a different window somewhere in Zoom because it's still live. So I'll give you a second to try to find it. You know how the Zoom windows, oh, you're on the phone. Well, maybe you have to swipe. Speaking of user experience, maybe on the phone you got to swipe to see the poll. I'm not sure. Maybe the polls don't work. Ah, Brad, we got the guy right. We got a hypothesis about the color shift, the zoom compression. That's right. Cool. All right, I'm going to end the poll. We got 87% of people. Thanks. Let's share the results here. Okay, so we had these, results. The biggest one by far was blue first, green second, red third. 68% of people did that, right? And it's not a coincidence that that's the top one. And what I'm going to do, I want to do this example, and I'm going to explain to you the rules for how your brain processes this stuff and why it kind of does this calculation of that. The next biggest one was red, green, blue. That's interesting. 13% of people said that. And I'll talk about that in a sec. And then red, blue, green. So 23% of people said basically, hey, red is first, right? And then there's 7% of people, 2% of people actually put green first, which is interesting. So let me try to decode what's going on and explain it so you can, the whole point here is once you know how the visual system of your brain works, you can use that when you're doing your layout of your wireframes, right? So here we go. Visual hierarchy, let's go, let me pull it up. Here are the rules. Basically position things that are at the top. Oh, what happened here? Yeah, things that are at the top are more important than things at the bottom. We read top down. So when something's at the top, it sends your brain a signal. The higher up something is, it sends your brain a signal. Okay, that's more important than something at the bottom of the page. Think of like a footnote, right? Footnotes are least important things are at the bottom, right? The other thing is in left to right languages, in English, we read left to right, then things that are at the left are more important than things at the right. Now, perhaps some people picked green because they're in a country that goes from right to left. And so that would send a different signal to you, right? And then size, your brain, things that are bigger it's yelling at your brain, I'm more important. If it's smaller, it's telling your brain I'm less important. And then finally, color or contrast. Things that are brighter, higher contrast are more important than things that are more subtle or lower contrast. So that this last point, some people's brains were really weighting that higher. So that's why they pick red first. You know, red in general is like this danger color. It's a very powerful color, right? So if we look at this, like this one is top, the blue circle is top, so it gets a point for top. It's left, so it gets a point for left. It's the biggest, so it gets 3. It's not the highest contrast color. It's not red. It's not screaming red or orange. If it did, it would get 4 points. So that one gets 3 points, right? This one, it's higher. It's higher than the red one. It's to the right though. It's not to the left of the red one, and it's bigger than the red one, but the color's not muted, so it kind of gets 2 points, right? And then this one, it's not at the top. It's below the other ones. It's left, so it's left, so it kind of gets a left point. It's the smallest, so it doesn't get importance for that, but it's also the brightest high contrast color with the red, so it gets away, right? So a lot of times people will pick the order differently there. So anyway, just a quick example. So what you want to do is take advantage of these principles to deliberately lay out the components. Like you need to think about, and in fact, before I'll even do a wireframe sometimes, we'll just make a list, like a text list, what things need to be on this page. And then I ask everyone on the team to prioritize it. What's most important? What's second most important? What's third most important? You know, the homepage is a typical example of this. Everybody wants like 1,000 things on the homepage. It's like, okay, well, what's the most important thing? We're going to make that the biggest. We're going to put it at the top. We're going to, make it pop more, those kind of things, right? Let me show you an example of a page where somebody really used the principles of visual hierarchy to make the page flow. They could kind of predict how people's eyes were going to go, and it led them to where they wanted to go on the page, okay? So this is a landing page for selling diapers. And what you're seeing is a heat map. And this heat map was because they had eye tracking on, and they could see where are people looking. And right, basically the hotter the color, the more intense, more percentage of gaze was there. And then it drops down to yellow and green. Now, what's the first thing? What was the hottest thing? What's the first thing you look at on this page? Feel free to jump in. And basically, it's like the baby's face, right? The first thing you see is the baby's face. Now, why is that? 1, it's top. 2, it's left. It's the biggest thing on the page, right? It's got those 3 things going for it. The other things are, we like pictures. Humans like to look at pictures, more specifically pictures of other humans, and more specifically faces, right? That's why you see so many landing pages and hero images. They have faces because we can't help look at that, right? So see, Anne said we look at faces. That's exactly right. So that's for all those reasons, your brain does the math and goes, I'm looking at I'm looking at the baby's face first. Now, I want you to think about, where does your eye naturally go next, right? And again, if you're in a left to right country, like English language, you're next going to go to this heading. It's the biggest thing. It's top. It's left to right. So it's not, but it's top. It's the biggest font size. It's kind of bold. It's popping, right? And then from there, where does your eye go? Well, then you start going to the paragraph. You start reading it, right? Smaller text, but it's below. We read top to bottom. And then you read the next one. And then your eye falls on this image. And then where does it go? It goes to the buy button, basically, right? It's like a buy button, right? This was deliberately done, right? Yeah, people don't read. You're right, Janine. They scan, though, but you will scan. Your eye will follow 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, even if you're not reading, and you'll end up at the buy button. And another company that's really good at this is Netflix. If you ever look at, I should have grabbed the Netflix page. If you look at a Netflix page, not only do people look at human faces, if the person in the picture is looking a certain direction, you'll look where they're looking. It's kind of like from the old days of, are they looking at a tiger that might be killing, that might be a threat? I better see what they're looking at, right? If you walk by a crowd of people looking at something. So on the Netflix ads, they usually have a family sitting on the couch looking at the TV. And guess what's on that same sight line? The sign up now button is on the same sight line. So anyway, that's an example of a good use of visual hierarchy. You want to take into account. Conversely, if you're sending signals to your users that this is important, but it's really not, it's going to really confuse them. They're not going to know where to go, what to click, and what to read, basically, right? Another important principle has to do with how our brain processes information. There's a set of principles called Gestalt principles. And there's actually several of them. I'm only going to cover 2, the 2 that I think are most relevant when you're trying to wireframe and do layout. But basically, it's a set of principles for how your brain visually perceives objects. The first one I want to cover is proximity, the proximity principle. Basically, the way this works is, in a design, when you see something, if there are objects that are closer together, your brain's going to think they're related. If things are farther apart, spread out, your brain's is going to assume they're not related. Let me show you an example. I'm going to show you some dots, and it's just a bunch of dots, but your brain perceives these dots as a square, right? And says these are all similar because they're close together, right? This is just a bunch of dots, but your brain perceives them as like 3 columns, right? Or 3 rectangles because of the way that they're spaced together, right? Here's another example, right? In both cases, we've got what, 6 dots, but these 6 dots you don't perceive as a common object. It's like, yeah, there's 6 dots spread out, but these 6 are like, oh, those belong together. That's a triangle, right? That's the idea of proximity. Now, what you want to do is you want to make sure that things that belong together in your user experience are close together. Things that are related go together, and not put things together that don't go together. Probably the number one thing I see is bad button or label placement. Let me show you an example here. So here's a bad example of proximity, right? Why is this bad? Well, you've got like 6 products on this catalog page, and the buy now button, it's kind of ambiguous. Is that buy now for the one above or the one below, right? It's kind of an add to basket. Is it for the one above or below? Because it's near the picture. Like this button is near this picture, it's closer to this picture, so you're not really sure, right? That's a bad example. So instead, if you did this, if you put spacing, then it would be clear, oh, this is all together. This buy now goes for this one. You know, this ad basket goes for this one. That's an example. And I grabbed some examples, these examples from uxmisfit.com. They have some good examples up there. So that's proximity, right? So you want to make sure you put things together that belong, that are related. The second example, principle I want to cover is similarity. And again, your brain, objects that look similar, your brain's going to presume are related. Things that look different, your brain's going to say, nope, those are not related, right? So here's an example of, this is just a bunch of dots. Some are white, some are black. Your brain automatically sees stripes, right? You're like, okay, there's rows. There's like different rows and stripes, right? Because your brain is grouping together all the white ones together in rows and stripes, and black ones in rows and stripes, right? And so your brain, what does similarity mean? Well, similar shapes your brain will process as similar size, similarity in color, right? Those are all similar things that you can use, right? So you want to make sure, and I didn't mention this, consistency is really important in UX design, right? You don't want to have a key action button be red on one page, but then blue on another page and purple on another page. Like, no, let's make all the key action buttons the same color. And in fact, the example from, again, UX Misfits is, this is a bad example because edit and remove are both the same color. They're doing different things. What's the primary action that someone's going to want to do, right? So here you can see the edit and remove have different visual treatments now. So it's clear when you're clicking one or the other. And I would guess from this UI, edit is more frequent and more common. Remove is probably a big deal. Like, it's like kind of like delete. You're probably going to want to have a confirmation. You don't want someone accidentally hitting that and removing something, basically, right? So again, as you're doing layouts in your wireframes or your mockups, keep in mind visual hierarchy, proximity, and similarity, right? Those are just some good principles. And then here's an example, going back to our chess.com. Here's the first thing I want to show you. Here's our friend Jake and the initial sketches that he drew, right? So these are definitely low fidelity. All he had some kind of, template, some stencil for an iPhone, but then he drew all this stuff by hand. Looks like with the tablet, actually, probably with the brush. He just drew, again, can you tell me you don't like the color he picked? No, because he did grayscale, right? All he's saying is, hey, I'm going to have 3 buttons like this and 2 things here and a bottom nav strip, right? That's what you're working through, basically, right? And then here he kind of so this is, I would encourage people, and this is what I encourage is people to sketch. And look, I know a lot of people don't draw or sketch because, like, hey, I'm not a designer. I didn't go to art school. I didn't study graphic design. I'm not good at it. I'll tell you, I'm not good at it. I watch my kids do their artwork for school, and they're like light years ahead of me. I am not. You want me to draw something, it's an animal or something, it's not going to look like the real thing at all. But I've learned to embrace sketching UX designs and just bust out pencil and paper or a whiteboard and just start sketching. It's low risk. And again, back to the design gap, if 80% of us have a design gap sometimes or often, who's going to do the sketching, right? So as a PM, you should get comfortable doing that. Okay, so that's kind of information architecture. Now I want to get on to interaction design. Interaction design is probably, oh, there you go. Someone, just real quick, someone saying, what are folks' favorite way to sketch? Someone mentioned Pencil Me In by Christina Woodkey. Christina Woodkey has spoken at our meetup twice. She's actually due to speak probably in April. The second edition of her book, Radical Focus, is coming out. So she wrote a book called Pencil Me In. And there are a couple other books on sketching. I think Bill Baxton has a book on sketching as well. So, but Pencil Me In is very accessible, small, fun read. So I recommend checking that out. Thanks for asking the question, Natalie, and thanks for the recommendation, Felipe. Okay, so interaction design is the next layer. Interaction design, obviously you want to have things organized in an intuitive way, but I think of all the things, interaction design is what most contributes to something being, is it hard to use or is it easy to use? How good a job did the team do on that? And so I have a fun little cartoon strip here about that. You know, as PMs, we're obviously focused on features a lot. So here we go. So here's someone talking, our PM is talking to the stakeholder. Your user requirements include 400 features. Do you realize no human will be able to use a product with that level of complexity? Good point. We better add easy to use to the list, right? So, and it's just funny because that's kind of how some people talk about ease of use. It's like, hey, you know, make it easy to use. Like, you know, it's kind of like the phrase people say to designers, like jazz it up. You know, jazz it up, make it pop a little more. It's very vague. Same thing of like making it easy to use. Making something easy to use means mastering those layers of that iceberg. It's not that simple. You can't just, it's not like a checklist item that you add. And the reality is users want to take the path of least resistance, right? In my book, I call it like, you know, my kind of my law of usability. The easier something is to do, to action or task, the higher the percentage of users are going to do it, right? And the harder something is to use, the lower the percentage of users are going to do it. People want to find the path of least resistance. And so that's why this photo is one of my favorite UX photos. You know, here's this nicely manicured park with these nicely manicured paths, you know, paved paths. And then here's this well-worn dirt path because everybody just wants to save time and take the path of least resistance. So they do that, right? That's what people want to do. They want to take the easiest way, the way with the least number of clicks, the least amount of time, the least cognitive load. So interaction design is how we make sure our user experience delivers on that. So it's literally how the user and the product interact with one another. You know, there's a field, you might have heard the term HCI, human computer interaction. I've actually taken an HCI class. You don't hear that term as much, but it's talking, you know, trying to focus on the interaction between the human and the interface. What does it entail? User flow. So thinking through the flow, navigation across multiple pages, navigation through an experience. That's definitely part of interaction design, right? Laura Klein, who's speaking next month, she likes to always say, what next? So when you're doing a UX design, okay, they click there, what next? What happens then? You know, and you should specify. If you don't think about it, I didn't get a chance to grab a screenshot, but the number of times I run into a dead end on a user experience on a web is just every time I hit a dead end, like there's literally nothing you can do. You know, there's no place to click. It doesn't tell you what the next step is. Nobody thought about what next, right? So we want to avoid that. And then, you know, some people will say, well, they can always hit the back button. That's a hack. Your UX design should not, it's like a bad joke. You have to explain it. A back button is having to explain your joke. You don't want to have to rely on the back button. Other thing is user input. Anything that the user can input, like controls, forms, things like that, that's part of interaction design. And more broadly, anything they can click or tap on, that's part of interaction design. So what are the artifacts you create to work through the interaction design? At a high level, you can do flowcharts. You don't see these as much today, but it's good to think through the steps of the process, especially if you have a complicated business process, a flowchart. I'll show you one in a sec, like, because then you can say, if they do this, go this way. If they do this, go this way. And then the big one these days that most people use is just prototypes, tappable or clickable prototypes. The tools have evolved to a point where they're really powerful and easy to use. So it's really easy to string together multiple screens or pages into a tappable, clickable prototype. Some of the tools, obviously flowcharts, Visio, OmniGraph, PowerPoint for prototypes, Balsamiq, Axure, InVision. You can take, you know, screenshots and string something together. Figma is a emerging and popular tool. Webflow, there's a bunch of tools. You can also do a prototype and go all the way to code it in HTML, CSS. But again, I'd rather use a tool to test it before I did that. Here's an example of a flowchart. You know, just, okay, the person first, the user's got to do this, and then there's a conditional, and, you know, if this and that. You're just thinking through the flow, right? This is just a very simple flowchart. But again, if someone on the team's not thinking about it, it's not going to be a good example. So here's some of people sharing some other, yeah, Adobe XD, of course, Sketch, of course, yeah, great tools. Yeah, I was going to do a pool on tools, but didn't get a chance to. All right, so let's go back to our friend Jake here on the chess.com. Now, what he did is he documented at a high level, the flow chart of the user experience of when you challenge a friend to play a game of chess. And he put the current one down here so you can see how many different clicks it requires. And he's got his first prototype, and you can see it takes fewer clicks. So he came up with a way, one way to quantify ease of use is, well, how many clicks did it take? How many clicks are required of the user? The other way is like a stopwatch. How much time did it take? So time and clicks are ways to kind of quantify, is one design easier or harder to use than another one, right? And you can see Iterative's prototype here. So just thinking through that. Another powerful thing, especially in mobile, is where you are documenting the flow, but you're combining it with the wireframe. So you've got multiple wireframes and you string them together by saying, okay, if you click here, you go here. If you click here, you go here, right? Especially, some designers will create a whole big sketchboard of all the different screens. So it makes it very powerful to see at a glance how you get from one screen to another and things like that. So again, interaction design is very important for ease of use. The last tip of the pyramid, tip of the iceberg we're finding there is visual design. And this is often called how it looks, versus what it is, right? It's just how it looks. And you can think about it as a layer on top, right? If you've got the skeleton, if we go back to Jesse James Garrett, you've got the skeleton. This is like the skin on top of the skeleton, right? People often call it chrome. What's the chrome, what's the chrome going to be? And if you think about a car, for example, if we were designing a car, the first thing, we wouldn't start out by saying, well, should we go with like turquoise or should we go with cherry red, right? That's not the first thing we would do. The first thing we would do is, okay, this car, how fast does it have to go? How many people does it need to hold? Like, what's the requirement? What are the goals of the user? And then we build a frame and we design the engine. And then, at the end. So I'm not saying it's not important, but you don't want to jump to it too soon before you've got the skeleton done with the information architecture and you've worked through the interaction design, basically. So what are the components of visual design? Colors, right? Obviously picking out the colors, fonts, icons, images, other graphical elements. And this is where you get the pixel perfect layout. Those wireframes were just approximate, right? Now you get down to pixel. When you work with a really good visual designer, they get things down to the exact pixel, right? So an important part of it is color. So I want to just start off with a quiz question here. Another poll, last poll of the night here, I think it is. Yep, on color theory. So there are primary colors out there, and I want to have a little quiz here. What are the primary colors? Is it red, yellow, blue? Is it red, green, blue, or is it some other set of colors? So I'm going to launch this poll and see what people think. Okay. Up to 60 quick voters. I appreciate it. Both. Okay. No giving answers in the chat until the polls close, people. Keep your answers to yourselves until it's pencils down time. Okay. 78%. Yeah, I'm cherry picking select things from that example, but from Jake from New Breed Studio. But when you go to that page, he's got amazing stuff on MVP and all this stuff there too. Okay. Oh, look at someone. People are asking clarifying questions. Okay, good. Okay. Going once, going twice, 3 times. Okay, cool. Here we go. Here's the poll. Okay, here's what we got. Okay, we got 64% of people say red, yellow, blue. That's what we learned in kindergarten with our tempura paints, right? Red, yellow, blue. Red, green, blue. 30% of people. That's as computer people now. We do RGB. That's what we learn now. And somebody says some other set of colors, right? 6% said that. So the reality is there's not just one set of primary colors. The way it works is you pick a set of primary colors and then you mix them. So it's like a primary color system. So there's more than one. So there is red, yellow, blue. That is a primary color system. That's what we learned back in first grade and kindergarten when we had our paints and we were mixing our paints together. And, basically yellow and red makes orange. That's what we learned. That was there, right? That was our red, yellow, RYB. Now, in computer land, we use RGB, red, green, blue, right? That's because the way the computer monitors work, they're projecting those 3 colors, right? And in print world, that's why somebody said, hey, we're talking about print or screen. My sophisticated designer people here knew that this was kind of a trick question. There's a cyan, magenta, yellow, black, where they actually use 4 colors. They have a, a black in there too, right? So, but basically you pick, the most common, these are some of the most common ones. In the computer world, you use RGB. What you do to generate the color palette is basically you just take, and this is called hue. This is a part of color called hue, where you take the primary colors, let's say they are red, yellow, blue, and then you just mix them. And when you mix them, you get the secondary colors. And when you mix the secondary colors, you get the tertiary colors. And you go da da da. You keep mixing and mixing and mixing, and then you get a color wheel, basically, right? So that's the palette of all the colors that you can basically pick. And then one thing that happens, as we know, there are some things like, there are things, well, it's the same hue, but it's like, seems like it's not as, dark or it's lighter. There are things, tints, shades, and tones, where you're taking a hue, a tint, you're just adding more white to it until it goes all the way to white. Shade, you're adding blue to it until it goes, black, sorry, I said black. Black until it goes all the way to black. And then tones, you're adding gray, basically, right? So that's what you do. And it's very common to pick the colors of your palette, the hues of your palette, and then create tints or shades of them, right? And so again, to have a real example, I'm gonna go back to our friend Jake here. Here's the palette he picked for his chess.com redesign, right? So he's got the blue, the orange, and the green, and then he's created, shades of those, tints of those, basically. And then he's got, gray and black, basically, right? So he's gonna, what this means when you specify a color palette is you are saying, I am only gonna use those colors, because if you don't have a color palette, and this happens in like kind of a lot of startups, is designers or developers just kind of winging it. Each page is kind of getting its own color. I think purple would be good on this page. I think green, and it's not, and again, consistency is really important here. Actually, he's got a question. Thanks. We'll hit the questions at the end, so we'll definitely get that one. So yeah, so this basically, and you can see that actually, and I'm looking at it now, he had a legend, these different parts of the product. So for the lesson portion, he's using blue, for orange, the puzzle, and the green, basically, right? And so then he takes those colors, and to go with the visual design, here's some of his style guide. He has more of it. And the style guide is a very powerful tool to ensure, one, that you thought through the visual design, and two, that you apply it consistently, right? And so what does that mean? Well, he's going through all the different buttons. Hey, primary buttons in play are gonna be green. Primary buttons in puzzle are gonna be orange or brown. Secondary buttons are gonna be like this. Tertiary buttons are gonna be like this. Here's my icons that I'm doing, right? They're all using that palette, and he's laying it all out here so that there's a consistent visual system here when you use it. So style guides are really important. It's kind of like in the design maturity model, at some point your team will get to the point of having a style guide, right? Whether it's in like Slack, Sketch or something like that, or actually like live HTML, CSS. You might have a library of like the actual CSS that needs to be applied, right? So that's the examples of visual design. So what I want to do is close out now with my preferred process. What's the process I like to go through when you're starting out with your MRD or your words to get to basically, to kind of work through the UX design? It also ties in with the Lean product process. How do we get customer feedback and validate and iterate based on that, right? So here, I'm going to walk through this process. Now, I like to categorize the deliverables by fidelity, which I mentioned earlier. Fidelity, again, is how closely does it resemble the final finished polished product? So the final finished polished product would be the highest fidelity possible. Going down to low fidelity would be like a crude sketch or something, right? Crude approximation. And then this y-axis is interactivity. Obviously in the full live product, it's fully interactive. I can do all the things. I can type in numbers. I can, I can do all kinds of stuff, right? Type in information and have it react to that. So interactivity means compared to the full product, how much can I interact with it? Can I click on things or not, basically, right? So in the bottom left, the lowest fidelity, lowest interactivity, we have the awesome hand sketch. Whether it's on paper or on a whiteboard, this is a great initial place for you and your team to explore designs, right? You can picture the words from the PRD and the user stories is living here. And this is our first dipping our toe in the water of trying to come up with a design. And, we want to iterate here, work through some sketches. This is where, doing it on a whiteboard with the team or the designer is great. With COVID, we can't do that as much. So people are sharing screens, using whiteboards. Like tools like Mural and Miro are very popular for collaborative design work like this these days as well. So, and once you get to the point of having a sketch that you're happy with, then you can take it to the next level up in the process which is clickable or tappable wireframe. So I explained what a wireframe is. It's low fidelity. It's in a digital tool now. It's in a digital design tool like Balsamiq. That's why it's higher fidelity than like a hand sketch. You might be using widgets and things like, you'll probably be using widgets. Again, we're gonna try to keep it grayscale so people don't fixate on the color and criticize the color too early, right? And it's more interactive because now you can actually click or tap. Like in these tools, in these prototyping tools like Balsamiq and Figma and things, you can create the widgets that you put in, people can tap and people can, you know, tap on controls, and then you can have it go to a different page or screen. So you can string together multiple screens or pages. And I actually like to do testing here to work through major issues of, are we missing any key functionality? Your team may be having debates about, do we need this feature in this MVP or not? That's a great place to test that. Also, information architecture, visual hierarchy, and layout. Are people understanding what's on the page or not? You can work through those rough issues. By keeping visual design off the table, you can work through those big issues, navigation, you know, and flow. I like to test these. Once you've worked through those big issues of missing features and information architecture and interaction design, then you can move up to the next layer of fidelity, which is clickable or tappable mockups, right? And now mockups, as we saw, those are higher fidelity. Now we are talking about colors and fonts and images and trying to be more pixel perfect, right? And you can use tools like InVision or Figma to basically have these be interactive, right? In InVision, as a non-designer, you can upload the image assets you get from a designer and create little hotspots, like a rectangle. Okay, around the register button, I'm going to create a hotspot. So if they tap there or click there, it's going to go to the next page. So I love testing here. This is where I do most of my product validation. Again, I like to test before I build. I do most of it. I'll do multiple rounds here. I'll test with 5 to 7 users, pattern match the feedback, iterate the mockups, and then go test with a new batch of users. And when you first test it, you're going to run into issues and problems and questions. As you iterate, hopefully you get to the point where there's no more complaints or very minor complaints, and people start going, wow, this is actually pretty cool. I could use this. And in some of my other talks, I shared an example of marketingreport.com where I did that. I don't have time to do that today. And then once you've gotten to that point with your clickable mockups, your prototypes, you can proceed confidently to live product, right? You can proceed confidently to testing it, to building it. But I do recommend testing your live product because these things don't have browser compatibility issues. They don't have server performance issues, anything like that. So this is just kind of a way, again, to iteratively work through your UX design, as well as test with customers to de-risk and see how you're doing and iterate as you need to. And actually, back to our friend Jake, he followed that process. So he had those initial sketches I shared with you. Then he went to lo-fi prototypes here, right? You can see, again, no colors yet. It's just layout. It's just a little more polished than the sketches were because it's in a digital tool. And he tested this with users. And then he progressed to high fidelity using Figma, using a high fidelity mockup now, where now he does have colors. He's using those icons and buttons that we saw basically, right? So again, I would recommend, I'll share the link to that page during the Q&A, but it's a really cool example of basically working through all the steps and analyzing it. The last thing I want to close out with is, sometimes we come up with a design or we have plans for our product and we go into development and things don't go quite as planned, right? And so this is my new favorite, one of my new favorite pictures I got to show you in a second here. And I like to think about we're envisioning like this version, the next version of our product is going to be this beautiful horse, like beautiful, it's just beautiful. And then we design it and we say it's going to be great. And you start building it and everything's looking good. But then you start to get behind schedule and, you start to have to cut corners and things. And so it's like, okay, well, let's just try to make it to be a little less, and then you got to hit that March 31st ship deadline and people start throwing stuff over the balloon, throw out of the balloon. And next thing you know, user testing gets cut, UX design goes out the window and your horse ends up looking something like this. This is my new favorite MVP diagram. Like this is what happens to people with their MVP. They start out with the best of intentions, everything's cool, and then the timeline slips and everything just goes out the window and your horse ends up looking like that. So don't let this happen to your product. Nay, so there you go. Don't let yes, it is horrifying and hilarious. Yeah. I think a lot of people have had the experience where we start out with the best of intentions and everything's good and then boom. So, all right, to sum up again, UX design is an iceberg. We naturally fixate on the visual design, which is important, but let's make sure we're working through, conceptual design, information architecture, interaction design, using the principles and frameworks and examples that I share with you. I do want to recommend some UX books. Here they are. The ones I could find on my bookshelf quickly, I took a quick picture of, and I've asked her, many of them have already spoken at Lean Product Meetup, right? So Non-Designer's Design Book. This is, if I had to pick one book, I would pick, if you're not a designer, I'd pick this book. It's so thin, and it's not necessarily for digital, but it just tells you all this great stuff about layout and things that are great. UX for Lean Startups. Laura's book. I just had it. There it is. Laura's book. So she's going to be speaking next month. UX for Lean Startups. Great book. It's awesome. What else we got? User Experience Team of One. Leah Bewley. So her talk, she spoke on this book at our meetup. It's one of my favorite talks. I have a lot of frameworks usually in my talk. She had a lot of frameworks in her talk. So it's called the UX Team of One, so that you can deal with the design gap, basically, right? Inmates Are Running the Asylum. This is one of the first books I read back when I realized the PRD wasn't going to cut it. Alan Cooper, he's a big pioneer in personas. And so this book has a lot of good advice on persona, basically, right? What else I got? Oh, Elements of the User Experience, right? From Jesse Deans Garrett. I mentioned that, also very thin. Hello Web Design. It's called Web Design, but it's just Design Fundamentals by Tracy Osborne. She spoke at our meetup as well. And her talk is great too. You should watch that video. That'll give you some practical tips. And if you want to really, really geek out, this is a textbook actually on information visualization. It really gets into how your brain and visual system works, why we have 3 colors, why are things like 3-color systems and things like that. Other books here, Designing for Emotion. Great book. Aaron Walter spoke here. The 2nd edition just came out earlier last year. He came and spoke at our meetup, so that video is available as well. And then Steve Krug is another OG usability guy. Don't Make Me Think. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about or read his book. It's great, as well as Rocket Surgery Made Easy. So, yep, so some books to recommend there. All right, so thank you very much. I hope that was helpful. I have a quick feedback survey on my talk. If you want to hold up your phone's camera, it'll open a quick, easy survey you can do, or you can just go to bit.ly/Dan-UX. I'll put that in the chat. Oh, Hans, nice. And now's a good time if you want to put your questions in the chat. Again, we're gonna be moderating and picking people. I'll call your name out. Then basically you can unmute and undo your video if you want to, and then we can take your question in person. So thanks. So with that, let me go to the Q&A doc and see what we got here. Okay, yeah. All right, Akshay Single.
Hey Dan, the question was, where do affordances fit? Is that part of visual design or is that part of interaction design?
Yeah, that's great. So affordances is a great UX concept that basically, there's another book called The Design of Everyday Things that talks about affordances. And basically, like a doorknob is an affordance. It's basically designed to go around your hand to make it easy for you to open the door. So an affordance is something that kind of communicates to the user, hey, you should use me for this purpose, and communicates it, right? So I think it's probably largely in the visual design. In the digital world, it's probably largely in visual design. You see like drag handles on things, right? Like I was just on my phone and I needed to edit the order of things. Well, they suddenly get drag handles to let you know, right? So I think it tends to be in that. Tends to be mainly visual, and there's just kind of, the other thing that's interesting I didn't mention that brings up Akshay is, a lot of times someone's going to design something like, you know what, I'm going to design some cool new interface widget that no one's ever seen before, but it's going to be perfect. And it may very well be pretty cool, but the challenge is nobody knows how to use it yet. And so it won't be an understood affordance. So the other thing about affordances is like, there are some well-known affordances that are out there that you should take advantage of, because if you use it, then someone's going to know what to do, basically. Right? So drag handles, for example, right? Hamburger menus now on mobile. Everyone's at the beginning, nobody necessarily knew what a hamburger menu, like what are those 3 lines up there? But now we've kind of learned over time, right? So somebody could say, you know what, I'm going to invent a new icon for a hamburger menu. It's going to be even better, but then no one's going to know what it is, right? So back to your question, I think it's largely visual design. Yeah. Please if you guys have other questions, by all means, get them in. All right, I think we got Hillary. If you want to unmute and answer your question?
I don't have any question. It's so good to learn from you.
Okay. So I saw something about what are some lo-fi wireframing tools in addition to Balsamic. There was a question about that.
Sorry.
It's okay. And then, so yeah, my favorite lo-fi wireframing tool is like pen and paper. That's a wireframing tool, right? So is a whiteboard. Now it's not digital, obviously. And in the old days, before Balsamic was around, I actually did that in PowerPoint. I did medium fidelity in PowerPoint. So and people used to do it in Keynote, and there's actually a widget library called Keynotopia. That's kind of the tools have now extended beyond that. You should, there are certain scenarios where PowerPoint can be okay, but the reality is the tools are a lot better. Balsamic is good. That's probably the best, and they've always maintained low fidelity. Like they've never tried to be like a Sketch or a Photoshop. It's funny because the original version of Balsamic, to subtly convey that it was low fidelity in just a sketch, if you all remember, like the lines of the widgets that you would do, they'd be like they wouldn't be straight, they'd be kind of hand drawn. And after they got so many requests from OCD designers and product people, they added a mode where you can turn on a mode that makes them all like nice straight lines, basically, right? So they're the ones that focused on that. There are people that use other, you can use a general purpose tool like Sketch or Figma. They let you go high fidelity. So again, back to what I was saying, is some visual designers will go straight to high fidelity and not do low fidelity, but there's nothing stopping you from using those tools for low fidelity as well. You just don't put the colors in, don't pick the fonts in, so.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, Janine, who had some comments, has a question. You want to ask your question, Janine?
Oh, yeah. Hi. Thank you for this. This is super helpful. Yeah. So I was wondering what strategies or kind of mindsets or do you use to keep your designs like focused and simple? Because it's easy to get carried away, but how do you stay focused?
Simple and focused. How do you keep your user experience simple and focused? One is don't go to visual design too early. That's one, right? That's the number one thing. Is the number of times I've seen teams just like start having discussions about fonts and colors like right away, and color palettes and things like that. Is just that's one way to stay lo-fi was one way. The other way is, and there's a legitimate question, like when you go to design something, should you design the product you plan to ship in 1 month or 3 months or a year or 5 years? And every once in a while, Agile is really good at everything's 2 weeks, right? So as if I'm an engineer working in Agile, I might want to know, well, what do I need to ship in 2 weeks? But if I'm the designer, I want to know, well, what's this going to look like in 6 months? I want to make sure that I don't design something now and then we have to change it later. So there's a legitimate discussion about that. But to keep back to your question, to keep it simple and focused, I wouldn't go too far out in time. There are some designers I know who are like, wait, stop. I need to think about like the next 1 year future of this before we can do anything. And so you have to have a balancing act between planning out far enough in advance, so you kind of lay out the rough lines of where you're going to go, but getting the specifics done. And then let's see what else. I think having, cross-functional reviews. Part of when the user experience gets complicated is because one person's been allowed to kind of drive it, and they kind of go off into their cube and they drive it, and they come, they come back from the mountaintops and they show you their design, and it's like, oh my gosh, you like designed the whole thing and we haven't even talked about it yet. You know what I mean? So having frequent check-ins with cross-functional reviews will help ensure it stays, kind of reined in. So those are some tips.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, see who we got next is Anne.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Dan. Thanks, Tim. So there's a little chat side conversation going on that I'll bring up. And it is situations where product managers are writing the business requirements. and doing the wireframes,
Yeah.
and not including the designers, even if they're sitting 10 feet away.
Yeah.
And it's
Yeah.
been an interesting conversation
Yeah.
in my current situation. So there's some great, thank you everybody for talking about that in the chat and your responses. It's not so much a question, it's just, what are your thoughts on best ways to manage that situation? Because it doubles the designer's work to have to deconstruct what the PM did and then start over, and then you have to explain it again.
Yeah.
It gets interesting.
Yeah, and I think we need to zoom out broader. So we talked about what happens if you have a design gap, right? And so for PMs to step in and do that when there's a design gap, they kind of have to. The question becomes, let's say you have fully staffed PM team and fully staffed design team. And by the way, design has rockstar interaction designers and visual designers. What should the PM do in that situation, right? As much as I like to geek out and do UX design, I'm not the world's best designer. If I have the world's best designer, I'm lucky enough to have them, I should let them design, right? So there's that thing too. And that's where sometimes PMs have learned that behavior because they've been in a design gap situation for so long. They've never been in it's not like they're necessarily trying to tell you, hey, I know but design better than you do, Mr. or Mrs. Designer. It's just they've gotten ingrained into that thing, right? So that may be why. And part of it is they need to adapt, right? If I'm on a team where I've got someone who's really good at wireframing on the design side, I, as a PM, I personally am going to spend less time. I'm going to spend more time with customers and researching and prioritizing and analytics and things like that, and defer that, right? If conversely, I don't have a design gap on the visual design side, I've got someone who's really good at visual design, but they're not doing wireframes, then I might still fill the wireframe gap, right? So I hear what you're saying, and sometimes there are PMs that go too far, and they're really excited, and they like, and sometimes, like a good middle ground I've seen is the PM will say like, hey, Ann, I just did some like rough wireframes to kind of try to convey my thoughts. I'm going to give them to you, but they are not meant to be like, you need to design it this way. They are purely illustrative. You can totally come up with your own design or whatever. That's fine. That's usually like a nice middle ground where someone's just trying to work through, because what I have found is working through wireframes helps you clarify your requirements. You know, it makes you think about certain cases that you wouldn't have. So I wouldn't go as far as to say, oh, PM should never wireframe, but it should always be in the spirit of, this is illustrative. This is like, you know, I'm not a designer, you know, and then if you have fully staffed, talented design resources to work with, because it doesn't make sense. And sometimes there are some PMs who just have such a strong locus of control that they want to do all that stuff. They want to make sure it comes out right. And maybe they haven't worked with that designer. They haven't built up the trust yet. They don't know, you know, that there are a lot of things that can lead to that dynamic. But so those are some thoughts there. And I guess if you've got a PM that's behaving that way, my top advice would be to try to sync up with them earlier, before they get too far down the path, and be like, hey, can we have an initial discussion? Can we whiteboard together, right? And whenever you whiteboard, it's always interesting who's the one that has the pen and gets up to the whiteboard, right? It's like, who's the one that does that, right? And I would say, like, if you've got a PM designer pair and one person feels very strongly about being the one with the pen, then all right, well, let's give them a shot to do it, and then the other person can comment, right? Doesn't mean you, so I don't know, but you know, that's what I would do. Try to get it earlier and try to explain to them that, hey, it's great you did all this thinking, but we have to rework. Here's what it means to us. Like, UX design is down. Like, if you think of making products as a factory line, which it isn't, but it's like, okay, PM should figure out, you know, what are the product requirements, what are the business objectives, and then design kind of takes the baton. It's collaborative throughout, but it's kind of, then dev gets it. So by being downstream, you can just try to make them aware of the impact of what they're doing. And I, you know, a lot of times there's probably either some good intentions and it's just they don't realize it, or there's a lack of trust or a lack of working in that kind of environment or in that way. So it's just a lot of education and empathy and relationship building. So
thanks for your thoughts. I appreciate it, Dan.
Yeah, I hope that's helpful. Okay, next up we got Jack Kelly.
Yeah, hi, thanks Dan. Just to jump. Yes, hello.
Hi. Hey, Jack.
Hi. Sorry. Just a general question. Are there any sort of design principles or maybe specific, I don't know, about color schemes or ideas that determine if an app can be sort of more like exclusive premium or like luxury feel in terms of its market position versus just sort of general acceptable best practices?
Yeah. You know, there's a whole, use a whole bunch of stuff on color, about certain colors convey certain things, you know. The number of financial services websites that are blue is like huge, right? It's like like Capital One, Chase, everyone's blue because blue's like this, you know, like trustworthy yada yada color, right? And like there's different things, and so you know, like black and gold tend to be luxury stuff. And so anyway, if you can read up on what those, and obviously it varies by culture too. Something that means one thing in one culture might not mean that in another culture. So you know, there's certain things with color. I think also fonts, like you could try to, you know, convey that. I think the general level of polish and attention to detail needs to be higher, right? You would have cognitive dissonance if it's like, we're a luxury brand, but these things aren't quite lined up pixel perfect on here, or the image quality is low, you know what I mean? So I think it's more those subtle things of what convey quality. And if we extract that in general, whatever brand attributes you're trying to project, in this case, it's luxury, but if it's trust, then that's why you do blue, right? Or if it's this, if it's we want to be warm and friendly, we're going to use warm and friendly colors. There was a discussion in the chat about cool colors versus warm and friendly colors, right? The other thing is we didn't talk about, actually, a big part of user experience is your copy, your text, and your tone, the tone of your text. That's part of your user experience too. You know, people jokingly said people don't read. That's true. They don't usually read a lot long text, but they'll read, right? And so that tone can be a key part of your user experience as well. I remember MailChimp, I was hoping to cover the concept of delight, but the talk was already so long. In my book, I cover it. And Aaron Walters, who was the head of UX design for MailChimp, he is a big thought leader in delight. His book, Designing for Emotion, talks about that. And part of MailChimp's delight, this is like years ago when I used them, they were an email service provider. When I first used them, it was just so obvious they were head and shoulders above all the other email service providers as far as user experience. And part of what conveyed it was actually the fun tone. You'd log in, it's like, hey, Dan, you're looking pretty good today, and like silly things like that, right? So I think that visual design, colors, you know, quality of images and fonts, and then tone and language, those are all things, and pixel perfection are things that can convey that brand, that high quality luxury if you're looking for that.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. All right, let's see, we got, next up, we got Daniel. Daniel, you want to ask your question?
Hey, sorry.
No worries.
Sorry, we're watching TV here, so I just texted in the chat. Like low fidelity tools for mocking the web design, mobile design. I saw Miro, but I have no clue what is the good bad.
So defining user journeys or process flows?
Like from screen navigation, like what's going to happen with the app, like if you want to build something. So like before building anything coding like that.
Like Balsamic? Like we were talking about?
I don't know. Like Balsamic I used for the web design before, but now we're talking about time, you know, login screen, user registration, and then click here. Like it's like web, but for mobile. What would be a good tool? It's like I'm leaning towards Miro, but I have no experience. I could easily make a mistake.
Yeah. I mean, I still like Balsamic. So the one I shared a Balsamic, they have a bunch of mobile things now too. So all the iOS widgets are in their widget library now, and all the Android widgets are in their Android library. So I think as far for low fidelity, I still am a big fan of Balsamic. And it adapts down. And in fact, when you render it on a phone, it'll render on a phone. InVision is also another good, that's not low fidelity necessarily, but Balsamic is really good still. And there are some other mobile optimized tools out there as well. But
and anybody here tried Miro? Because everybody at work is using Miro. Says, oh, just why not learn Miro?
Which one?
Miro, M-I-R-O.
Yeah, I use it.
That one has some.
Yeah, it's basically, but the thing is, it's like a digital, it's a virtual whiteboard. That's how I would describe it. So it's not necessarily a prototyping tool like Balsamic. You could put stuff up there, but that's more for your team to use to collaborate on design.
But it does have templates. There are like 3 sets of templates for web design, and I wasn't sure. So sorry, I'm taking so much time.
No, it's okay. No, Mural and Miro, good to see you, man. Yeah, Mural and Miro are very popular for teams to collaborate on things on a virtual whiteboard these days. So yeah, but I would check out Balsamiq, what they can do for mobile tools.
I did use them like a decade ago, so I just gave up on the old tools.
No, but they've been around. They're still going.
That's going to be easy then, adjustment.
They've a lot of new high fidelity tools have entered the market, like Adobe XD and Sketch and Figma. But on the low fidelity end, Balsamiq's still pretty much the main one. So
yeah. And maybe my comment, like I'm not UI guy, I'm just kind of architect and more on the product side, but like focusing on colors too early and the copy, like I think it's more important to make sense how screen navigation works. Does the product fit? And then like colors come later, like that's based on your personality. So
agreed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye. All right. Let's see. Next up, Carrie, you want to ask your question?
Sure. Yeah. Hey, Dan. I met you once and realized you were at Intuit with the designer I knew at Adobe. So this is kind of a time frame for my question. Is back in the desktop days before the wild world of consumer mobile, you had these kind of constraining professional style guides, from the OS. So these days, are there conventions that are supposed to constrain how you design UX, or is it really so much more freeform now and just based on whatever mockup or wireframe tool you use?
Yeah. So the question again was, the context was in the old days, in the desktop days, like Windows would determine much of your UX design. That would be the constraints, like a Windows button. This is how a Windows button looked, and and this is how a menu looked and how this looked. So it's true that you have way more flexibility on the web now and mobile than that. Now, in iOS, it just depends. I mean, the iOS and Android still have some conventions. On the web, you're more flexible, do what you want. But I don't think there's any real hard constraints that that I see. I think for your app to get approved by Apple, your buttons have to be big enough for human fingers and things. They have the guidelines and they've actually documented them all. It's pretty cool. If you actually read the long guidelines that they have, and your app won't get approved if it's too small. So they're just usability constraints. They're not like you need to use this widget or not, and that's what's fun and interesting to see as new paradigms come and go. So like the hamburger menu, or like different ways to like rearrange things or sort things or things like that. So I actually think you're seeing, especially in mobile, more innovative controls and more innovative things. And the interesting thing is to see people like adopt them, and even like Android and iOS, stealing ideas or copying ideas from each other. And once they see one person doing, oh, that's cool, you swipe down to get this thing. Okay, let's add that. Or you swipe, So there's some convention, and that's, I guess, the conventions are more on the interaction, I guess. Like, what does, a tap mean? What does this do when you swipe to the left? That's a delete, or things like that. So, but I feel like you have a lot of latitude, and I think that, again, back to what I said earlier, some people creativity is awesome, but sometimes they'll like create something that's so creative that people can't figure out what it is. And so you want to be creative, but you also want to keep an eye towards convention, and be deliberate when you deviate from convention, but do it deliberately when you really have a big UX breakthrough that's going to really improve usability or achieve some concept that somebody else hasn't done. Then that's when you want to do it, not just do it for the sake of doing it. Otherwise it might be hard for people to figure out, and then you can test it and iterate it, so, but I do think we have a lot more flexibility these days than we do in the old desktop days.
Thanks.
Okay. Raul Flamenco, you have a question? Hey,
yes,
Raul.
absolutely. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah.
I learned so much, by coming to you. The question is, as I work with customers, enterprise customers, and testing the problem part of it, there are two parts to it, right? One is the problem, and the one is solution, which is mostly the proposition. So my question is, how early to engage with a UX, and what would be your recommendation for a lean startup, right? It seems to me that as of today, I'm gonna have to read that book, Lean Startup UX, huh?
Yeah, UX for lean startups. It's good. Yeah. It's interesting. The question is, hey, I'm an entrepreneur working on an idea. When's the right time to bring in a designer? You can bring them in too early, you can bring them in too late. That's the way I hear your question, right? So I do think, if you go back to, hold on, the product market fit pyramid that in my framework, let me go back here. Yeah, you can bring someone in too early before you really know what you're doing, and you're just gonna waste cycles. They're gonna,
Exactly.
you need to provide some direction. So here's the process, right? You need to kind of figure out what's the market opportunity I'm going after, right? And what's the value prop and even the feature set. So theoretically, you could work all the way 1 through 4 and then say, okay, let me get a UX designer. Right now, it might be beneficial to bring in the UX designer to have them involved with the discussions a little bit, ramp up their involvement as you get to number 5. But yeah, you've got to figure out the market opportunity, right? And I've seen that happen where somebody brings in a designer too soon before they figured out what they're going to do. And then the designer either sitting there twiddling their thumbs, or they just pick something and they start designing it, and you head down that direction kind of randomly instead of it being deliberate. You know what I mean? Yeah. So I think you need to, back to what you're saying, you need a good enough handle on the market opportunity, the customer problems you want to solve. You can do competitive analysis as well to inform your value prop. And so once you get to the point of, okay, we think this, maybe after value prop would be a good time, to bring them in. And then they could also look at competitors. It's interesting on that chess.com thing as well. The designer did a competitive analysis as well. Yes. So yeah, so I would think once you get to like step 3 of the pyramid or the process, then you can kind of bring in a designer.
Okay, thank you.
All right, yeah, you're welcome. Good to see you. Good to see you, Raul. Yeah, take care. Okay, I think we got through all the questions of the people that are in the meeting.